Pyongyang has threatened an atmospheric nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean in response to Trump's threat to destroy the DPRK. Can we take any of these provocations literally? During the just concluded CPC Congress, Xi Jinping spoke of how culture is the country's soul, how important is cultural soft power as China commands increasing economic and political power. And we begin today's program with the DPRK issue, or the North Korea issue. The DPRK's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho recently warned that a possible atmospheric nuclear test over the Pacific Ocean should be taken literally. He said Pyongyang may consider conducting the most powerful detonation of a hydrogen bomb amid rising tensions with the United States. Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis is visiting South Korea ahead of U.S. President Donald Trump's trip to Asia next week. Mattis is emphasizing the Trump administration's push for a diplomatic solution to the problem, but he also has said that the U.S. is prepared to take military actions if the North does not halt its development of missiles that could strike the entirety of the United States. So, will Trump's forthcoming Asia tour encourage the DPRK give up its nuclear ambitions, or the other way around? We are now joined by a strong panel with us here in Beijing. Zhao Tong, associate in the Carnegie's Nuclear Power Policy Program based at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome to our program. In Medford, the U.S., we have Sung-Yoon Lee, a Kim Koo-Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at the Tufts University. Welcome, Professor. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. I want to welcome the three of you. Gentlemen, may I begin with you, Professor Lee? How should we understand the remarks given by the Defense Secretary of the United States visiting right now South Korea? He talked about three words which we haven't heard for a long time: complete, irreversible, and also verifiable. Remember, those three words were used during the six-party talks when we talk about the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. Those three words are being repeated this time. Interesting.
Well, CVID, so-called complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. That formulation appears on every single UN Security Council resolution. It appears in U.S. sanctions legislations against North Korea. That is the stated goal, one that is a fleeting goal at this point, probably. I think Mattis is trying to reaffirm the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea, trying to send a strong message to North Korea on the eve of President Trump's visit to the region. Don't do anything drastic like a hydrogen bomb test. You know, of the two very specific threats the North Korean foreign minister made during his visit to New York in September, I ask you again, and our viewers, of the two, the right to shoot down a U.S. spy plane or any plane outside their territorial airspace and the hydrogen bomb test in the Earth's atmosphere, which is the greater threat, which is more likely to trigger a military response from the United States? I say it's the shoot down which will kill American servicemen. The hydrogen bomb test will, of course, be a grave provocation, but will not be seen around the world as cause for war. Therefore, it is highly likely that North Korea will do it.
I see. Mr. Eland, do you agree?
Yes, I mean, I think both things could lead to war, or you could have a miscalculation. So all this hot rhetoric on both sides is really not doing anybody any good. And I'm afraid that you know, the provocative moves on both sides so far are not good either.
I'm not sure whether the U.S. at this point, at least during this trip in South Korea, is that provocative, at least by the words on the paper. However, Mr. Zhao, we heard different tones coming from different members of the delegation. The Joint Chief of Staff of the United States is, rather than the Defense Secretary, talking about the right for the United States to defend itself and also to retaliate once there's more further provocation from the North. How should we understand this apparent mixed messages coming from the same delegation?
I think there is a real division of views within the White House. Very recently, some senior officials in the State Department, like Joseph Yun, who is the top diplomat to North Korea in the United States, he openly expressed the view that White House has been working to handicapping diplomacy with North Korea. So apparently there is a major difference of view, especially between the senior State Department officials and President Trump himself. So it's not surprising that different people are talking different things. And also in my private discussions with senior American military officials, they also are very skeptical about the feasibility of a military option against North Korea. But President Trump wants to appear very tough and wants to seriously consider the military option. Therefore, they, the military, have to prepare a military option. So we have to recognize there are a variety of views within the White House.
On the other hand, the North Koreans are not staying there either. They are busy as well, at least when it comes to provocative words. Professor Lee, earlier we talked about the atmospheric nuclear test on the Pacific Ocean. What would that mean in terms of the North's capability demonstration to the rest of the world? And how does that say about a real danger it would pose to the United States?
Well, one of North Korea's highest long-term strategic goals is to push the United States to downgrade its support for its alliance with South Korea. And of course, North Korea has been losing that systemic contest for pan-Korean legitimacy vis-a-vis South Korea. So the way to be able to bully South Korea, perhaps even prevail over it one day, is to get the U.S. troops out of there. How do they do that? They credibly threaten to nuke a major U.S. city. So they need to demonstrate that they have the capability to marry a nuclear warhead on an ICBM, and that means they have to test it. So that day will come eventually, despite all the grave implications of the first nuclear test in the Earth's atmosphere in decades.
Mr. Zhao, do you concur what Professor Lee just said? What is likely to be the capability with this test, if there is a test?
I think North Korea has achieved the basic capabilities to do that. The missile, the intermediate range and ICBM missiles are certainly capable of delivering a certain payload to several thousands of kilometers away. So it should be capable of delivering a thermonuclear warhead to the Pacific Ocean. The only remaining technical question is whether North Korea is capable of building a reliable reentry vehicle that can survive the reentry of the missile trajectory. And maybe that's one of the reasons North Korea is saying it is going to do so, because it wants to demonstrate openly to everyone that it can build a robust missile with a robust reentry vehicle, and everything can actually work. So that's how it delivers a message of deterrence to the United States.
We're going to continue our discussion, gentlemen, but for now, let's bring in this piece of breaking news in the Spanish region of Catalonia, where Parliament has just voted to declare independence. And the Spanish Senate has just approved direct rule in Catalonia. The Catalan Parliament approved the motion to declare independence with 70 votes in favor, 10 against, and 2 abstentions. Thousands of pro-independence demonstrators gathered in front of the entrance of the Catalan Parliament to show their support before the vote begins. Of course, that is an evolving story. CGTN is going to bring you more as it further continues. For now, let's come back to our discussion. One other thing I want to ask you, Mr. Zhao, is with President Trump to China, the trip, going to South Korea first and then China. And of course, he has been lowering his rhetorics over the past. The phone call with the Chinese President Xi Jinping after 19th Party Congress just concluded, and certainly this time you see the cabinet members, the Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, also use very similar level of tones as well. What would this mean to you as a China scholar?
Well, we did see Trump actually praising China for taking tough pressures against North Korea. Actually, Trump said China is helping, but Russia is not helping. But with that said, I do think Mr. Trump might see an opportunity to put more pressure on China, because he might believe that President Xi is in a better place to take tougher sanctions against North Korea, because after the conclusion of the 19th Party Congress, maybe the Chinese leader will have more bandwidth in addressing the North Korean threat. And after he reassuring his East Asian allies, South Korea and Japan, I think the message he will deliver in Beijing is, look, it's the perfect time that we further enhance international isolation against North Korea. So I'm afraid China will be under greater pressure from the United States to embrace a comprehensive embargo against North Korea.
Mr. Eland, that's why we need to go to you right now. What is, even if it is at its primitive stage or at its chaotic stage, what do you see is this way of the Trump administration to push for a solution of the DPRK nuclear issue? Is it pressuring China combined with preparation militarily toward the DPRK? What is it? How to characterize it?
Well, I think the United States is rattling the saber, but at the same time, of course, Tillerson on this, Mattis on this pass is stressing negotiations. So, you know, you have good cop and bad cop. But I really think they probably will pressure China to do more in sanctions. I don't think China is going to do that much, and I don't think even if they did, it would work. I think North Korea feels that after what happened to Libya and Iraq, Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons, and Libya gave up their nuclear program, but those leaders were both taken out. I think North Korea looks on nuclear weapons as deterring the U.S., as you pointed out, and I think that's what's going to happen in the long term. The United States is just going to have to, and the rest of the world is going to have to deter a nuclear North Korea with weapons that can be delivered with long-range missiles. That's where we're headed.
Where we're heading, how far are we from there? Of course, earlier you have talked about, Professor Lee, the capabilities of DPRK at this point. But during this process, from where we are to the possibility of it become a nuclear nation, which the world will not recognize, of course, what would this process mean, particularly this visit by President Trump to China?
Well, I'm sorry to say, North Korea is a de facto nuclear state. We all know that. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test more than a decade ago in October 2006, and the latest test in September showed that North Korea has the capability to even develop and test a hydrogen bomb. So North Korea is a veritable nuclear state. What does that mean for North Korea and the region? Will North Korea stop there with apparent second strike capability, deterrence capability? No. Of course, nuclear weapons give North Korea tremendous power of self-defense and deterrence, but North Korea won't be satisfied here. It needs to prove, it needs to show that it can nuke a major U.S. city almost at will, and it's not there yet. So North Korea will get there eventually. How soon? I don't know. But, you know, North Korea has a habit of making peace overtures in the early part of the new year, and now we're headed toward the end of 2017, which has been a banner year for North Korea. So I think there's a good chance North Korea will resort to another major provocation before the year's end, and then say, let's let bygones be bygones, let's start anew in 2018. That's North Korea's strategy.
But what about the U.S. strategy, Professor Lee? I mean, with President Trump's visit, top on his agenda is the DPRK nuclear issue. Besides pressuring China with further sanctions, what else can he do? And any strategy do you identify from the United States? Any chance that the United States might have a discussion more above the water with the DPRK for some kinds of possibility to resolve the current everlasting crisis?
If North Korea causes more headaches, more trouble for the Trump administration, and then makes a dramatic gesture of concession and says, let's talk, there is a chance that the Trump administration will accept North Korea's proposal for direct talks. We saw that with the Bush administration many years ago, despite the stated hostility, rhetorical bellicosity and ideological hostility on the part of President Bush himself against Kim Jong-il. So that possibility is always there. For now, though, I think the Trump administration is resolved to try to enforce sanctions, put more pressure on China, yes, but also through diplomatic channels try to galvanize the world, other UN member states, to do their part to downgrade and cut off even diplomatic relations with North Korea. Will that produce any results anytime soon? No, because sanctions enforcement takes time. It will take at least 2 years, maybe 3 years to have any kind of impact.
We have seen recently of some so-called Western media reports talking about a DPRK steadfast still despite sanctions. Having said that, though, Mr. Zhao, here is the thing for you. The 19th Party Congress is being considered as an important timepost for China's contemporary politics. And as a result of that, there are different kinds of stages for China, it seems, the so-called new era. And of course, diplomacy and the philosophy behind the diplomacy, the logics behind it, could also be evolving as a result. So how would that, Mr. Zhao, if you are reading the tea leaves in your cup, what does that mean, possibly, for China's attitude on the DPRK nuclear issue and on the upcoming visit by President Trump when the two leaders are going to discuss about the DPRK nuclear issue?
Well, at one level, President Xi Jinping made it very clear that China needs to take a more active leadership role in global governance. And that means China will continue to uphold important international principles and norms. And non-proliferation is one of those important international norms. So that means China will never retreat from its position that the ultimate goal of the Korean Peninsula has to be a denuclearized North Korea. However, President Xi also said during the 19th Party Congress that China will never swallow the bitter fruit of allowing its key national interests being undermined by other countries. And the North Korean issue, China is actually under that threat because the Trump strategy is actually shifting the burden to China, letting China take all the sacrifice and the costs for sanctioning North Korea. So China, I think, will continue to resist that in order to defend its own legitimate interests, and will continue to promote a more pragmatic approach of trying to freeze North Korea's capability in the near term.
Mr. Eland, it is being very much advocated from China about the so-called double suspension, namely the United States, South Korea suspend the military exercises, further so-called provocation as China sees it toward the DPRK, and let the DPRK also suspend its further nuclear tests and also hydrogen bomb tests. So this is what China proposed, and China takes pride in it. It suggests that this is one of those, productive way to get to some result, at least. So it seems that China is quite confident in its approach toward diplomacy on this issue, particularly after the 19th Party Congress. So, Mr. Eland, what would this mean for the Trump administration when it comes to further, or efforts trying to further push pressure on China? Will it succeed, or actually it could go exactly the opposite direction? Mr. Eland.
Yes, I think so. I think the Chinese could resist that. I don't think, because North Korea has been a friendly country to China, even an ally in some senses, they don't want the regime to collapse because they would have a unified Korea on their border. They don't want the regime to collapse because of refugees, etc. So I doubt that pressure on China is going to have that much effect on this whole thing. And I also think that actually China's suggestion to me sounds pretty good, but the U.S. doesn't want to do that because they think that this will drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States, and that the alliance this was a blow to the alliance. But these alliances that we have in the Pacific, I think we really ought in the long term think rethink these. I mean, South Korea and Japan are wealthy countries, and they should be able to defend themselves from North Korea without the United States. And I just don't see, I see these alliances dragging the U.S. into conflicts that we don't need anymore. And I think we're overextended given the fact that we spend half the world's military spending, but we only have less than a quarter of the GDP, so we're overextended. So why not let these countries do more? I think that was Trump's original orientation, but I think the American bureaucracies have beat it out of him, these advisors that he has, and he's retreated from that. But I think his original line of reasoning was pretty well, even though he's not familiar with the details of things.
Mr. Zhao, you want to respond to that?
Well, with due respect, I disagree a little bit with our American experts' view that China opposes the reunification of Korean Peninsula. There is certainly a variety of views in China on this issue, but apparently China itself is also a country that has yet to achieve national reunification. And the majority view here, I think, does support Korean reunification. The only issue is there should be more discussion between China and the United States, and hopefully also involving South Korea, about what should be the right security structure on the Korean Peninsula after reunification is achieved, and also how to reform the UN Security Alliance to make it better capable of addressing today's security threats in the region. I think those issues need more discussion among these countries.
See, gentlemen, this is what we talk about. This issue about the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue is becoming ever more complex because there are so many issues related to it, and there's not much confidence and trust among all parties about any of those issues, this included. Professor Lee, you want to come in here and talk about, help us to understand really, at this juncture, besides finger pointing, is there any specific things that can be achieved on this issue during President Trump's visit to South Korea, during President Trump's visit to China?
Well, with respect to U.S.-South Korea relations, I think something can be achieved, which is to improve the bilateral relationship. It is very strong on the surface, but there's an undercurrent of tension between Mr. Trump and Mr. Moon of South Korea. So the more meetings, discussions the two leaders have, the better it will be to get back on the same page. With respect to the United States not being further involved in Korean affairs or defending Japan, all that would be good if it were not for the fact that the last time the U.S. did that, withdrawing troops from South Korea in the summer of 1949, a year later there was a war. Why? Because North Korea is fundamentally a revisionist state. It is not happy with the international environment, the very unfavorable international environment which it finds itself in as the permanent inferior backward Korean state. So if the U.S. were to relieve itself of its duty to defend South Korea, the more tempting it will be for North Korea to bully South Korea and perhaps even start a war of liberation.
All right. And before we go, I want to have every one of you one simple sentence and one sentence only about what can we expect really when it comes to the nuclear issue on Korean Peninsula with President Trump's visit to Northeast Asia. Let's go with Mr. Eland first.
I think we're lucky if we don't have a war because of the heated rhetoric and a miscalculation. I don't think the U.S. has a duty to defend a South Korea that now has 40 times the GDP of the North.
Professor Lee.
The North Korean nuclear issue will only be resolved when things get a lot worse for the region and for U.S. security, and or if South Korea and Japan go nuclear in the future, as far-fetched as that sounds, it is still within the realm of the possible.
Wow. Mr. Zhao.
Well, I think North Korea might continue to conduct some provocations because it has a technical need to do so, but it's also fortunate that there are going to be multiple opportunities for the regional national leaders to meet and touch base. Besides the U.S.-China summit, the Chinese and South Korean presidents are going to meet at least at the APEC summit and also the East Asia summit meeting. So it's a very good opportunity for high-level diplomacy.
We'll see what's going to happen. Zhao Tong, Sung-Yoon Lee, Ivan Eland. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much for your views and your insights.